In New York City right now, you can rent an apartment where you have to walk through someone's bedroom to reach the kitchen. Thousands of people do it every day. Most of them have no idea they're living inside a floor plan that was specifically engineered, not for comfort, not for dignity, but to extract the maximum possible rent from the minimum possible space. This is the story of that floor plan, and of the city that decided it was good enough. On a cold morning in 1811, 3 men sat down with a ruler and redrew the island of Manhattan. No building stood in the way of their ambition. No neighborhood was consulted. John Randall Jr. and the commissioners he worked alongside simply imposed a grid, straight lines running north to south, east to west, cutting across hills, streams, marshland, and whatever else the island held. Between those lines, thousands of identical rectangular lots. Each lot measured 25 feet wide and 100 feet deep. That dimension would later be called the root cause of the worst housing crisis in American history. It would produce buildings so dark that children grew up never seeing sunlight in the rooms where they slept. It would crowd hundreds of thousands of people into airless interiors and help spread tuberculosis, typhoid, and cholera across the most densely populated neighborhoods on Earth. And it would do all of this not through accident, but through simple arithmetic. The commissioners who designed that grid were thinking about property sales, not housing. 25 feet wide was wide enough for a respectable row house. 100 feet deep gave a buyer enough room to build something substantial. The city would grow, land would be sold, and order would be maintained. That was the plan. What they did not account for was what would happen 60 years later when hundreds of thousands of immigrants began pouring into Lower Manhattan and needed somewhere to live. Immediately, cheaply, and close to the docks and factories where they would find work. When that moment arrived, the grid was waiting for them, and so was the railroad apartment. To understand the railroad apartment, you need to stand inside one and feel it. You enter through a front door, and you are already in the first room, a narrow rectangle, maybe 12 feet wide, lit by a single window facing the street. This is the front room, the parlor, the place where the household presents itself to the world. Move toward the back, and you pass through a doorway into the next room. There is no hallway, no buffer. You are simply in another room, and to reach the one behind it, you must pass through this one too. This is the defining feature, the thing that gives the railroad apartment its name, rooms connected in a straight line one after another, like the cars of a train. In a typical 3-room tenement flat from the 1870s or 1880s, you had a front room, a middle room, and a rear kitchen, all arranged along a single axis from street to backyard. To reach the kitchen, you walked through every room in between. To reach the bedroom, a visitor walked through the parlor. Privacy was not a feature of the design. It was not an oversight either. It was simply never part of the calculation. A builder who wanted to extract maximum rent from that lot had one problem to solve. Hallways took up space. Corridors cost money to build and earned nothing in return. A stairwell was a necessary evil. Everything else was waste. So the solution was elegant in the way that ruthless things often are. Stack the rooms, connect them directly, and sell access to each one. No wasted inches. Every foot of the lot converted into revenue. A 5- or 6-story tenement built on that lot in the 1870s might contain 4 small apartments per floor, each one a railroad flat running front to back. The whole building, barely. 25 feet across at the street would house dozens of families. By the late 19th century, buildings like these were stacked side by side across the Lower East Side, Kleindeutschland, 5 Points, and similar neighborhoods, a continuous wall of narrow brick faces, stoops, and fire escapes that stretched for block after block. The arithmetic of the layout was simple, and it was ruthless. Take 97 Orchard Street on the Lower East Side, perhaps the most studied tenement building in American history, now the anchor of the Tenement Museum. Built in 1863 by a German immigrant named Lucas Glockner, it stood 5 stories tall on a standard lot and held 22 three-room apartments. Each apartment was approximately 325 square feet. 3 rooms, no hallway, 1 window facing the street. That was what a working family rented for a home. Between 1863 and 1935, an estimated 7,000 people passed through the apartments of that single building. 7,000 lives compressed into those narrow rooms, cooking, sleeping, working, grieving, giving birth, and in many cases dying, within a floor plan that a modern real estate listing might describe, with no irony intended, as cozy. Architect Ernest Flagg, writing in the 1890s, was less diplomatic. He called the 25 by 100-foot lot the greatest source of evil in New York's tenement problem. Worse, he said, than plague or fire. Deep and narrow buildings meant interior rooms with no access to light or air. Rooms without light became rooms without ventilation. Rooms without ventilation became rooms where disease moved freely between bodies sleeping inches apart. The railroad apartment was not a failure of planning. It was the logical product of a planning system that treated the urban lot as a unit of profit first and a place to live second, or not at all. To stand on Orchard Street today and look up at the brick face of a tenement is to look at something that has not changed much on the outside. The cornices, the window lintels, the modest ornamental brickwork, these details were not accidents. Builders applied them because ornamentation commanded slightly higher rents. The facade was a performance. It announced a level of respectability that the interior, stripped of hallways and light, could not honestly sustain. The city that immigrants saw when they arrived was the city of stoops and brick facades and the electric hum of commerce. The city they came to live inside was a different place, a series of narrow rooms arranged in a line, each one opening directly into the next, with no room to hide and no room to breathe that did not also belong to someone else. That layout, rooms strung like boxcars, was not simply a housing type. It was a record of who the city thought these people were. And for 60 years, hundreds of thousands of men, women, and children made their lives inside it anyway. And the people who designed that equation never had to live inside it. But someone did. That's where the story actually begins. Lucas Glockner did not think of himself as a villain. He was a German immigrant who had come to New York in the middle of the 19th century, worked his way into modest prosperity, and done what ambitious men of his era did when they had a little capital and a lot of ambition. He bought a lot and put a building on it. The lot was at 97 Orchard Street on the Lower East Side. The building was 5 stories of brick, 22 apartments, and a ground floor storefront. By the standards of 1863, it was a reasonable investment. By the standards of the people who would live inside it, it was something else entirely. Some landlords felt genuine solidarity with their tenants. That solidarity did not stop them collecting rent on rooms without windows. Glockner was representative of an entire class of men who built tenement New York, small-scale speculative landlords, many of them immigrants themselves, who saw the same equation that the city's grid had made available to anyone with eyes and arithmetic. The calculation was not complicated. It did not require cruelty. It only required that the person doing the math never had to sleep inside the rooms they were designing. The economics of the railroad tenement were built on a single organizing principle: minimize every square foot that did not generate rent. A hallway cost money to build and earned nothing. A courtyard was wasted lot coverage. A wide stairwell was an indulgence. Interior rooms that borrowed light from nothing at all were acceptable if the law allowed it, and for most of the 19th century, the law allowed almost everything. The result was a building type engineered from the inside out by financial logic, a machine for converting land into income, with human beings as the necessary medium through which that conversion happened. The typical 5-story tenement could hold 4 apartments per floor, each one a railroad flat of 3 rooms. At the rents prevailing in the 1870s and 1880s, somewhere between $8 and $12 a month for a 3-room flat, a fully occupied building generated steady income against a construction cost within reach of middle-class investors and small syndicates. Builders did not reinvent the tenement with each new commission. Block after block across the Lower East Side, Kleindeutschland, and later East Harlem and Brooklyn. The same plans, the same sequences, the same crews. The railroad layout was not an architectural decision made fresh each time, it was a template, and the city's grid was the mold it filled. For the tenants inside, the financial logic looked different from the other side. A working family, arriving in New York in the 1880s, faced a housing market with very few options at the bottom. Boarding houses offered a bed but no kitchen, no privacy, and no address of one's own. Rear yard shanties were cheaper but more precarious. A railroad flat, for all its limitations, offered something that mattered: a door that locked, a kitchen where food could be cooked, and a fixed address that allowed a family to anchor itself to the city's networks of employment, school enrollment, and community. The rent consumed a significant portion of household income. Reformers estimated between 1/4 and 1/3 of wages. To manage that burden, families did what the layout of the railroad flat made almost unavoidable. They took in boarders. A boarder renting a bed inside a 3-room flat was not unusual. It was a financial survival strategy built into the architecture. The linear sequence meant any room could be rented separately. A bed in the front room to a man. Working days, the same bed to another man working nights. Reformers documented families of 6 or 8 sharing that space with 2 or 3 additional lodgers, bodies arranged in shifts around a single shared stove, a single bucket, a single window onto the street. What the reformers sometimes missed, and what the landlords certainly understood, was that this was not a perversion of the railroad layout. It was the railroad layout functioning exactly as designed. The absence of hallways, the direct connection between rooms, the minimal square footage, all of it made the flat as flexible as possible for maximum occupancy. The landlord who built the building and the family who rented it had reached the same conclusion from opposite directions. Every room was a unit of income, and no inch could be left unmonetized. Jacob Riis, the Danish-American journalist and photographer whose 1890 book, How the Other Half Lives, brought tenement conditions. To a middle-class audience that had largely preferred not to look, put the landlord's arithmetic into plain language. The tenement, he wrote, was never built to give the poor a home. It was built to take the money of the poor in exchange for the minimum possible shelter that would keep them paying and keep the inspector away. The inspector in those years was rarely a serious threat. A landlord who received a violation notice for a dark interior room might respond by cutting a small window between that room and an adjoining one, technically satisfying the requirement while providing no actual light or air from outside. The letter of the law? Met. The spirit of it? Discarded. The rent? Continued. What made this financial logic so durable was that it operated within a system where no single actor had to acknowledge the full weight of what the system produced. The grid commissioners of 1811 set the lot dimensions and moved on. The builders worked from standardized plans and collected their fees. The landlords collected rent and minimized maintenance. The city inspectors checked boxes and filed reports. And the families who lived inside the railroad rooms absorbed the accumulated consequences of every decision made above them in the chain. The building at 97 Orchard Street kept collecting rent for decades, housing thousands of people through waves of immigration and reform and economic upheaval until rising code requirements made it cheaper to seal the upper floors than to bring them up to standard. In 1935, the apartments above the ground floor were closed and left untouched, the furniture and fixtures and wallpaper frozen in place like a photograph taken in 3 dimensions. When preservationists opened those rooms decades later, they found the railroad flat exactly as it had always been. Narrow, dark, efficient, a room leading into a room leading into a room with no wasted space anywhere, and no room left over for anything that did not serve the original equation. Walk through the front door of a railroad flat, and you understand, within 3 steps, everything the building thinks of you. There is no entry hall, no moment of transition between the public world of the staircase and the private world of the home. The door opens, and you are already inside, standing in the front room, the parlor, the space the family has arranged to present its most composed face to whoever might come calling. A window faces the street. Light, on a good day, reaches perhaps 6 feet into the room before it gives up. Ahead of you is another door, leading directly into the next room. There's nowhere else to go. A sequence of rooms in a straight line, each one accessible only by passing through the one before it. No corridor alongside them, no neutral path from front to back. Movement through the apartment is movement through every room in it. And every room is someone's bedroom, someone's workspace, someone's only private space in a city that offers very little of that to the people who keep it running. The front room faced the street. It was the largest of the 3, though large is a relative term in a flat, perhaps 12 feet wide in its entirety. This was the parlor, the space where a family displayed whatever small dignities it had managed to carry across an ocean and fit into 12 feet of width. Lace curtains, a religious icon, whatever they had. Reform photographers who entered these rooms in the 1890s sometimes noted, with what reads as genuine surprise, how carefully residents had arranged their belongings, how much effort had gone into making a space that was structurally disrespectful look like a home. The front room also doubled as a workroom in many households. Garment piecework, sewing sleeves, finishing seams, attaching buttons, required no special equipment beyond a sewing machine and a table. In peak periods, the parlor might contain 2 or 3 women working at machines from early morning until late at night, with finished bundles stacked against the walls and raw materials draped over every surface. Visitors who came to pay their respects, collect rent, or simply borrow a cup of something had to navigate around the work. Behind the front room was the middle room, and this is where the railroad flats logic became hardest to defend. The middle room had no window to the outside world. In buildings constructed before the 1879 Tenement House Act, it had no window at all, a sealed interior space lit only by what leaked through the open doorways on either side. After 1879, it had a window that faced the air shaft, a narrow vertical void between adjacent buildings, rarely more than a few feet wide, that the law had mandated as a source of light and air, and that served in practice as neither. The airshaft window looked out onto brick wall 3 feet away, darkened at the bottom by garbage that tenants threw down because there was nowhere else to put it. This room was almost always the bedroom. In a family of 4, 2 beds pushed against opposite walls with barely enough space to stand between them. In a family of 8, and 8 was not exceptional in the documented records of the 1880s and 1890s, the same beds used in rotation, day workers sleeping while night workers were out, night workers returning to sheets still warm from the bodies that had just left them. The middle room was also, in the worst cases, the room rented to a boarder, a space with no exterior window, no possibility of solitude. Every trip to the shared toilet in the hall required passing through a room where other people were sleeping, working, or eating. Privacy was a curtain strung across a doorway, a blanket hung from a nail, a shared agreement between exhausted people to look away. The rear kitchen was the functional heart of the railroad flat, and in many ways the most honest room in it. It faced the backyard, actual light, thin and compromised, but real. It contained the stove, which in the coal-burning era was the source of both cooking heat and the only warmth the apartment had in winter. The sink, where water arrived by pipe after 1880s reforms, forced running water into tenement buildings, and where, before that, a bucket was filled from a pump in the hall or the yard. It was where food was prepared, laundry scrubbed, children bathed, where the family gathered in the evenings around the only warm surface in the flat. It was also a thoroughfare. Because the kitchen sat at the end of the railroad sequence, anyone passing from the backyard staircase, where coal was delivered, waste removed, the rear exit led, came through the kitchen to reach the rest of the apartment. The room that was supposed to be the domestic interior of the household was also, structurally, a service corridor. Women anchored their days in that kitchen, cooking 3 meals on a coal stove, maintaining the fire through winter nights, washing clothes by hand, carrying water to fill the tub, preparing food for a family and sometimes boarders as well. Reform literature documented the physical conditions in considerable detail: the coal dust, the condensation, the smell of cooking and laundry and bodies in a room without ventilation. What it documented less carefully was the sheer volume of work those conditions represented, performed by women whose labor made the household function, but whose names rarely appeared in the accounts of landlords or inspectors. What the 3 rooms created together was a set of conditions that collapsed every distinction the 19th century tried to maintain between different kinds of life. Public and private collapsed because the parlor was a workshop and the bedroom was a passage. Work and rest collapsed because piecework continued after dinner and boarders slept through the noise. The family's interior life and the landlord's financial interest collapsed because every room was simultaneously a home and a unit of rent. A family that needed a boarder to make the month's payment had no room in their apartment that was not already, in some sense, occupied by the terms of that necessity. The front room maintained the performance of respectability. The middle room held everything that respectability required keeping out of sight. The rear kitchen sustained the physical life of the household while pretending to be just a room at the end of a line. Together, approximately 325 square feet. 3 rooms, 1 door to the street, 1 window facing the world. That was the railroad flat. That was home. Every brick in a Lower East Side tenement was touched at least twice before it became a wall. The first time, somewhere along the Hudson River, a worker dug clay from the riverbank, packed it into a mold, and fed it into a kiln. The brickyards that lined the Hudson from Manhattan north through Dutchess County were among the largest industrial operations in 19th century New York, employing thousands of workers, many of them recent immigrants, some of them children, in conditions reformers described as only marginally better than the tenements those bricks would eventually build. The clay came out of the ground, the bricks came out of the kilns, and barges carried them downriver to the city's piers, where they were unloaded by hand and hauled by horse-drawn wagon to construction sites across Lower Manhattan. The second time a brick was touched, a mason, Irish or Italian or Eastern European, hired through a trade network or an informal street corner arrangement, lifted it from a pile, set it in mortar, and tapped it into place. Thousands of times a day. A 5-story tenement required hundreds of thousands of bricks. The work was physically punishing, seasonally unstable, paid by the day with no guarantee of tomorrow. The men who laid the walls of railroad tenements lived in many cases in buildings nearly identical to the ones they were constructing, narrow, dark, designed to extract the maximum rent from the minimum space. This was the first hidden labor of the railroad apartment, the labor that built it. Timber came from upstate New York and New England forests. Iron for fire escapes and railings from foundries that also supplied the city's docks and bridges, the same industrial web that would later employ the people who moved into the buildings it helped construct. The clay pits of the Hudson Valley, the logging camps of the Adirondacks, the iron foundries of New Jersey, all of them fed into the tenement boom of the 1870s and 1880s, extracting labor and raw material from one set of places and converting it into rental income in another. The building at the end of that chain was a railroad flat on Orchard Street. The people at the beginning of it rarely saw a city at all. Inside the finished building, a different kind of labor began, and this one never stopped. The domestic work of a tenement household was structured by the railroad flat's layout in ways that made it harder, not easier to perform. Coal had to be carried up from the basement in buckets, flight, by whoever was available, usually a woman or an older child. Water, before running pipes arrived under legal pressure in the 1880s, came from a pump in the hall or the yard, carried up in the same buckets. Laundry done in a washtub, water heated on the stove, clothes scrubbed by hand and carried to lines strung across the courtyard or the air shaft or the roof. Reform photographers returned repeatedly to the image of laundry hanging between buildings, sheets and shirts suspended, over narrow courtyards almost touching the windows opposite. The image became an icon of tenement crowding, reproduced in newspapers and pamphlets and history books. What it never showed was the woman who had washed those clothes. The labor was visible in its output. The person performing it was not. Many railroad flats were also simultaneously workshops. Garment piecework, cigar rolling, artificial flower making, home industries that moved through tenement neighborhoods in waves, following contracting arrangements of manufacturers who found it cheaper to distribute work to apartment-based laborers than to maintain factory floor space. A family that took in piecework converted its front room or middle room into a production space. Sewing machines where parlor furniture might otherwise stand, bundles of cut fabric stacked against walls, children old enough to thread needles enlisted into the work alongside their parents. The railroad layout made this both necessary and exhausting. There was no separate room for the work, no boundary between workshop and bedroom, no space in the linear sequence that could be closed off as purely domestic. The labor of the factory followed the workers home because home and factory occupied the same 3 rooms, connected directly into each other with no door that meant anything. The men who contracted that piecework, the manufacturers who set the piece rates, and the landlords who collected rent on the apartments where the work happened all extracted value from the same space. The family in the middle absorbed every cost, rent, materials, labor, time, and kept whatever margin, if any, remained. That margin was rarely enough. Consider the superintendent of the building, often a resident himself given a small rent reduction in exchange for collecting payments, handling minor repairs, and standing between landlord and tenants, a tenant behind on rent, a landlord expecting collection. A super in the hallway between them, knowing exactly what both need from him, too poor and too tired to satisfy either cleanly. He owed the landlord compliance. He owed his neighbors something closer to solidarity. Most of the time, the building asked him to betray one to keep the other. The labor that built the railroad apartment, supplied its materials, maintained its daily function, and produced goods within its walls was everywhere in the tenement district and almost nowhere in the accounts of the people who profited from it. The brickyard worker, the mason, the woman at the washtub, the child sorting buttons at midnight, they were the infrastructure of a city that preferred, when possible, not to look too carefully at the hands that held it up. The reformers who climbed tenement stairs in the 1880s and 1890s came with clipboards, measuring tapes, and a genuine conviction that what they were documenting was an emergency. They were right. But they were also, in ways that took decades to fully surface, part of the problem they were describing. Jacob Riis arrived in a tenement room with a flash powder camera and produced images that shocked a middle-class audience into demanding change. Reformers counted toilets per floor, measured room dimensions, compiled reports that landed on the desks of legislators and newspaper editors. Their work produced real results. The 1901 New York State Tenement House Act was directly shaped by the evidence they assembled. Windows were required in rooms that had never had them. Indoor toilets replaced shared backyard privies. And yet the story that reform told about who was responsible placed the weight, quietly but consistently, on the wrong set of shoulders. Reform literature blamed the people in the rooms, not the man who built them that way. Overcrowding was attributed to the habits of particular ethnic groups. Dirt and disease to the supposed ignorance of people who did not know how to maintain a proper household. The darkness and airlessness of interior rooms appeared as conditions that certain populations had failed to demand alternatives to, rather than as the direct consequence of a landlord's decision to build without windows because windows cost money and earn none. This framing was not accidental. It served a purpose. If the tenement's conditions were caused by the people living in it, then the solution was education and inspection, interventions that left the financial structure of the railroad flat and the profit it generated essentially intact. Attacking the financial structure itself meant confronting the interests of landlords, investors, and the city's political machinery that depended on their support. Rees himself, whose sympathy for tenement residents was genuine and whose outrage at their conditions was real, nonetheless described his subjects in language saturated with ethnic stereotype and implied cultural deficiency. He documented suffering and simultaneously suggested that certain groups were more naturally suited to it than others. The camera caught what the eye saw. The captions told a different story. Black residents of New York's tenement districts occupied the lowest position in a hierarchy that was already built on exploitation. While Irish, Jewish, Italian, and Eastern European immigrants faced discrimination, they existed within a system that offered, at least in theory, a pathway upward, toward outer borough neighborhoods, toward buildings that were newer and less deteriorated. Black New Yorkers, whether long-established residents or arrivals from the South, faced a different set of closed doors. Landlords who rented to black tenants often did so only in buildings that white ethnic groups had already abandoned. The oldest, most neglected railroad tenements were deferred. Maintenance had accumulated for decades, and code enforcement was least likely to reach. Black residents paid rents frequently higher than those charged to white tenants for comparable or better apartments, reflecting the constrained options available to them and the leverage that constraint gave to landlords. This was not yet the era of formal redlining. Those mechanisms would be codified in the 1930s. But the informal architecture of exclusion was already fully operational, directing black families toward the most deteriorated railroad flats and keeping them there through landlord preference, neighborhood hostility, and the absence of any legal protection against either. Inside many of those same railroad flats, a different form of exploitation ran on a daily schedule. The home-based sweatshop was not a marginal feature of tenement life. It was a central economic institution of the garment industry, the city's largest manufacturing sector, operating almost entirely within railroad apartments on the Lower East Side. Contractors distributed cut fabric to apartment-based workers, predominantly women and children, who sewed finished garments for piece rates set low enough to ensure that no individual worker, however fast, could earn a living wage without working hours that precluded anything else. Poor ventilation, inadequate light, coal dust from the stove mixing with fabric, lint in the air, children working alongside adults because the household could not survive without their contribution. Factory inspection laws that reformers had fought hard to pass did not apply to home-based work because the home was technically private space. The sweatshop moved indoors and became, legally, invisible. Eviction completed the picture. A family that fell behind on rent had almost no legal recourse. A landlord who wanted a family out could have them out, and the family's accumulated domestic life went with them onto the street, the lace curtains, the religious icons, the sewing machine that was also their primary income-generating tool. The slum clearance campaigns of the mid-20th century arrived with the language of improvement and the machinery of demolition. Urban renewal programs targeted tenement districts across Manhattan and Brooklyn, replacing dense blocks of railroad walk-ups with highways, housing projects, and institutional buildings. The residents displaced were not in the main offered equivalent housing nearby. They were scattered into other overcrowded neighborhoods, into public housing towers on the periphery, into whatever was available at the bottom of a market that had never treated them as full participants. The neighborhoods that disappeared were not simply collections of deteriorated buildings. They were ecosystems of mutual aid, informal economy, cultural life, and social memory built up over generations inside and around the railroad flats, cramped rooms. The buildings were gone. The networks they had housed went with them and were not reassembled anywhere. What remained was the same uncomfortable truth the reformers had circled around a century earlier, that the railroad apartment had never been a failure of the city's housing system. It had been the housing system, functioning as designed, extracting the maximum possible return from the minimum possible investment in the lives of the people who had no other option but to pay for it. In 1935, the upper floors of 97 Orchard Street were closed. The decision had nothing to do with preservation. Rising code requirements demanded upgrades, plumbing improvements, fire safety measures, structural repairs, that would have cost more than the rents from those floors could justify. So the landlord did what struggling building owners across the tenement districts were doing in those years: sealed the floors, locked the doors, and left. Everything inside exactly as it was. The apartment sat untouched for decades. When the Tenement Museum began its restoration work and opened those rooms to the public, they found wallpaper still on the walls, fixtures still in place, the physical record of families' lives suspended in a darkness uninterrupted since the Depression. The railroad flat had not been renovated out of existence, it had simply been forgotten, and forgetting accidentally had saved it. That building on Orchard Street is now one of the most visited historic sites in New York City. Tourists move through its narrow rooms in small groups, guided by voices reading from letters and diaries left behind by the families who once lived there. They stand in the rear kitchen where women cooked on coal stoves and scrubbed laundry in iron tubs. They look at the dark middle room where boarders slept in shifts. They move from room to room along the single axis of the railroad, sequence and understand, in their bodies if not always in words, what it meant to live in a space with no room that was only yours. The museum does this work carefully and seriously. It names the families. It recovers the specific textures of specific lives rather than generalizing into abstraction. It is one of the better acts of public history the city has produced. And 2 blocks away, a renovated railroad flat in a similarly aged walk-up is listed for $3,500 a month. The listing describes original details, pre-war character, and exposed brick. It does not mention that the layout requires walking through the bedroom to reach the kitchen. That particular feature is left for the prospective tenant to discover in person. This is where the railroad apartment has arrived, split between Memorial and Marketplace, between the careful recovery of what these rooms cost the people who had no choice but to live in them and the breezy repackaging of that same floor plan as a lifestyle choice for people who have several. The rooms have not changed. The linear sequence, the absence of hallways, the front window and the rear kitchen, all of it remains. What has changed is who bears the cost of the layout's limitations, and whether that cost is understood as a historical condition to be remembered or a design quirk to be managed with clever furniture. 7,000 people passed through 97 Orchard Street between 1863 and 1935. They came from Germany, Ireland, Italy, Eastern Europe. They sewed garments in the front room and slept 4 to a bed in the middle room and cooked on coal in the rear kitchen and carried water up 5 flights of stairs and paid rent that consumed a third of what they earned. The building is still standing. The railroad is still there. The question the rooms keep asking, Who is this city actually? Built for has not yet found a final answer.